Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Coffee and Compliance. This is the April edition. We're going to be looking at enforcement and regulatory updates. Sorry we missed the March version of this, but we're back at it with our normal kind of news and briefing updates for April. For future months, we're going to mix in some guest speakers talking about air permitting and air quality issues, and we're also going to have some attorneys on to talk about recent enforcement cases and get a little bit more into the details than we do on this typical format. So be on the lookout for our May, June, July webinars with some guest speakers coming on coffee and compliance. Couple of housekeeping, we'll send out a copy of this recording. We also turn these into our podcast. If you haven't seen or listened to our podcast, we take a lot of our content, both from the summit and from these webinars, and turn it into podcasts so you can listen to it while you're driving, working out, walking. But you can check it out on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It's Mappistry's EHS Aligned podcast. The other thing is, if you have questions, feel free to submit them through the chat here, and I'll try to answer them if you have them on some of the cases that we're going to cover today. With that being said, we're going to dive into it. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Ryan Janik. I'm one of the co-founders here at Mappistry. One of the things that I like to remind people is, what is Mappistry? We've got a lot of our customers on these webinars in the morning, but there's also folks that drop in that maybe have never seen Mappistry before and want to learn a little bit about it. So we're an environmental compliance platform that enables you to conduct and track all your compliance activities, everything from doing tasks and reporting deadline reminders to inspections to actually capturing the data that goes into air, waste, water permitting, and be able to analyze that and actually ensure compliance and be proactive in your environmental programs. And I'll give you a little bit of a sneak peek at the end too of some of the stuff that's coming out on the environmental data side. So we're going to jump into it. WOTUS, it seems like every year Waters of the US is in the news. The latest update here is there was a Congressional Review Act resolution to overturn the WOTUS rule that Biden's EPA and US Army Corps had put out. He vetoed it. This was in the past couple of weeks that this happened. In March 2023, a judge froze the rule that was out there just in Texas and Idaho. And as many of you know, there's still a Supreme Court case, the Sackett case, that's under consideration. We should be getting a ruling this year on that. That also will change things. So lots of stuff going on. It continues to go on back and forth, back and forth. And I put a little bit of a history here. And there's a lot more like intrigue and developments and back and forth in between all these years, between like 2015 and 2020 and 2020 and 2022. But one of the big things to pay attention to is the significant nexus. This is one of the items that's really contentious with both the rule and the court rulings and all. This is the issue that's really needs to be decided to move forward with Waters of the US. I don't foresee this really coming to any resolution, even with a Supreme Court case ruling. I think it'll still be tested. We'll still get variations of it, and people trying to work within the confines of the Supreme Court ruling for whichever side they fall on Waters of the US. So I anticipate this to continue to be a political issue, continue to be in the news, both with Army Corps and EPA going forward. I think as administrations change, it creates more turbulence too with this as we get this push and pull on the waters of the US. So I've got a number of cases over the past, say, 30, 40 days that have come out and looking at different environmental media types, because I think it's a good reminder. And for everybody on here, an environmental professional, you get the kind of the risks and the penalties associated with compliance. But it's a helpful reminder, and especially if you want to share this information with others in the company as you're advocating for budgets and funding to implement training programs, to buy software, to take on new initiatives, just what gets people in trouble and what are some of the consequences. This is two cases out of Iowa for haz waste violations. One is a manufacturer of construction equipment, about a $55,000 fine. This is the, handling the determination side, kind of the program elements that really got them in trouble there. And then the other one, $26,534, really wasn't handling it at all properly or filing the right paperwork on site. And wanted to point this out as also the states. I think it's interesting, these cases across the US. It's not certain states have higher likelihood of environmental laws. Sometimes that's true, but also we see in every state where like targeted enforcement starts, and I'll show you that in a bit. But these were two haz waste ones out of Iowa, Region 7. This is a really expensive one, and something that I'll also touch on a little bit later. This was air violations. It's a coating and laminating company in Connecticut. A whole bunch of violations came out of this, but basically not doing the permit requirements around doing stack testing and then using those results to look at capture efficiency. And then even just the basics around logging usage and using that usage logs to actually calculate VOCs. This was a $300,000 penalty for one facility. So really, really expensive. This is something that reinforces, like, for me, from a justification standpoint of like why use map history software. One of the things we've invested a lot in over the past year is our environmental data platform to solve this exact problem. And there's a couple webinars we have coming up, one on compliance calendar, remembering to do your stack testing and all the requirements as part of your air permit. But number two is like capturing all these usage data and then running those calcs and making sure you have the records. A lot of that stuff can be automated. Which is the exciting part for what we've been building on the environmental data platform. Is a problem like this could actually be solved through a lot of automation and reminders and save somebody $300,000. But yeah, really expensive air permit violations out of Connecticut for not tracking like usage and running the calcs and looking at capture efficiency. So if you want a good justification as to why invest in systems and processes for like the basics, this is a really good one, because remembering to do the requirements on stack testing, remembering to every day log the coatings used and run those calculations. This is very expensive and a high risk thing that resulted from it. Now we jump over to California. This is SPCC violations. This was something around animal fats and vegetable oil, really targeted because they captured 6 companies total around this, looking at SPCC violations. The costs, one of the facilities I think got away with just a $1,000 penalty, but a couple in the 6, or at least a couple that I found in the 6 figures range, highest being 175,000. One example, they were originally facing a $259,000 penalty. It got cut to about in half, but they didn't have an SPCC plan. They didn't have a facility response plan, and they'd spilled 13 gallons of oil. And it ended up costing them over $100,000 in penalties. And the interesting thing here is we often see in like violations the maximum amount. They look at the gallons, the days, and then they calculate a maximum. I've always seen usually a big differential between the penalty amount and what was originally estimated on the violation side. This one caught my attention because the differential is not that big, about half, which means that they're sticking closer to those maximum penalties. And if you were on our Coffee and Compliance in February, you saw the big jump on the per day penalties. So it's something to track. And something we're paying attention to is how often are regulators staying to those like higher end potential violations. At our annual summit in September this past year, one of our speakers was talking about that, of like kind of the aggressive nature from a regulator or inspector side of sticking with higher amounts of penalties. And I don't know what folks on this webinar today have seen, but just something to pay attention to. We always used to think that like, wow, that we'll never get those, $50,000 a day penalties times, 200 days of violations. But it is something to bear in mind, because we are seeing the settlements come out a little bit higher and pushing more towards those maximum side. So this is just a good reminder of what is a definition of oil, and if you're in the food and beverage industry, something to consider and pay attention to. And if you've got products like this, it's worth looking into what meets the definition of an oil, and making sure that you've got the appropriate SPCC plans, spill response measures, and the associated training and tracking with that. Another really interesting one, to be honest, I really enjoyed putting this list of enforcement cases together because it covered so many different environmental media types, and really goes back to what we've seen and talked about a lot at Mapistry around proactive environmental compliance, both in states that don't have a reputation as being high environmental enforcers, and also for industries and applications that people sometimes will dismiss and say, "Oh, that never happens to me." I think it's interesting, one of the things on the air side, that $300,000 fine, people sometimes dismiss, "Oh, the air stuff, oh, we keep our paper records. Yeah, we don't keep it up to date all the time." $300,000 is a big penalty, so it shines a light on like the importance of the little details. This is another example. This is a transportation company. We often get transportation companies that don't want to be so proactive, saying, "Oh, I never get in trouble." It's all those other dirty manufacturing industries that get in trouble. This one's a big one, over $500,000 penalty. I'm sure, when we estimate costs like the legal fees, consulting, the actual impact is multiple millions of dollars for this. It's a stormwater violation for transportation, not something you see every day. 200 facilities across 47 states. The other interesting thing is the state agencies that led the enforcement: Louisiana, Nevada, and Maryland. Maryland, being in the mid-Atlantic and Chesapeake Bay, has a reputation for environmental enforcement. Nevada and Louisiana don't always have that. So it's an interesting development of seeing state agencies without a reputation as being really aggressive on environmental prosecutions, leading the enforcement efforts. At a state level, they did a subset of the facilities, found violations, and then pulled the rest in. Earlier on our coffee and compliance on haz waste, very similar case. We're seeing this more and more where we get multi-state level environmental agencies doing inspections, audits, compliance, and then banding together and pulling EPA for a nationwide. So anybody with a nationwide company or a big regional operation, having a strategy, a defensive strategy against like state level, multi-state level enforcement actions turning into a really big case. But this is transportation, and it honestly is, they're getting in trouble for the basics, like not implementing VMPs, not doing spill and leak cleanup, not training employees. All these basic things that I think a lot of us take for granted in a well-run program and are kind of core compliance items is what's getting them in trouble. And the list of settlement measures that they've got to implement coming out of this is quite extensive. I would draw parallels with this to a concrete ready mix case from about 10, 15 years ago that was a multi-state action where they had to create environmental compliance positions, put a system in place. Very similar. It was also for stormwater, much bigger penalties. So I think it was $17 million in that one. Obviously a bigger manufacturing facility than transportation. But it is interesting, the aspect of like a multi-state enforcement action, stormwater being the primary driver. And it's really around the basics, and having a great system and a program in place would have prevented this. So those are cases that I took a look at, went into a little bit of detail across SPCC, air, haz waste, and stormwater, kind of covering all the environmental areas. Although EPA has their national enforcement initiatives, what I'm seeing is a kind of a smattering of different environmental media types and targeted enforcement. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of the national enforcement initiatives, if there are clear trends on it. One of the things that I noticed on this is that state agencies are pushing some of these enforcement actions, and we will see EPA kind of come in on top of that. So it's something to pay attention to if you're getting any kind of activity at the state level for enforcement actions. Will that bring in EPA also, or will it stay a state level issue? The other big takeaway from these cases over the past 30 days is a lot of it is around the core compliance activities. It's remembering deadlines, it's remembering to do training, and like if you're relying on like frontline personnel for operations production to do a lot of your environmental activities, making sure they have the right training and they know what they're doing, both for like haz waste handling, labeling procedures to logging production throughput materials usage for air permits to making sure that people know how to do a basic stormwater inspection for control measures, spill cleanup, that type of thing. It's really around the basics around compliance is still what's getting people in trouble that we're seeing. We do see like exceedances and we see those violations, but at the end of the day, a lot of these penalties are tied to like core compliance and having really good systems, programs in place and training for personnel, especially non-environmental personnel. So with that, we're going to wrap up our briefing for today. One of the things that I wanted to talk about tied to some of this is our environmental data platform. We have had a version of this for a couple of years now, but one of the things we're releasing next month is an even more extensive version of this to run air permits, water permits, waste tracking, to be able to handle all these data streams that come in and run calculations, look at limits, and then centrally manage like resources like air pollution control equipment, assets to run all these calculations. So if you're interested in learning more about this, we're going to be doing a couple of webinars on this. We're going to be releasing in 2 weeks or less than 2 weeks our compliance calendar. So building on top of what we've done with task tracking, but if you're interested in managing reporting deadlines and all, please reach out and we might be able to even get you early access to the compliance calendar that we're launching for tracking regulatory deadlines and all. And then the final thing for folks on here, every year we run our annual summit, our annual conference. We bring together folks from around the country, EHS leaders. This year we're going to be in San Diego, September 11th to 14th, and we're going to have speakers on similar topics to this, doing an even deeper dive. We've had some great presentations on like what is the risk, what is the financial penalties. Some of the attorneys that present really have a data-driven approach to the enforcement trends. But we're going to be talking about that, program best practices, and then going deeper on the technology side. A lot of interest on like how we integrate and automate sensors and other data into Mapistry to run like air emissions calculations automatically, so you get it out of the hands of frontline personnel. But then looking at analytics and then just the management of data as a whole, from manifest data to air and water data. So if you're interested in joining us in person and like going even deeper on regulatory issues and enforcement cases, you can find out more information at mapistry.com/summit. And with that, we can wrap up for today. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email, Ryan@Mapistry, or drop it in the chat and I can try to answer it. But I appreciate everybody jumping on this morning for a quick update on what we're seeing from enforcement cases and regulatory trends.